October 25, 1917, 2 a.m. A single gunshot echoes through the Winter Palace in Petrograd. The man holding the rifle isn't a soldier. He's a factory worker named Ivan Petrov. His hands are shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He hasn't slept in 3 days. He hasn't eaten a real meal in 6 months. His children are starving at home. His wife died last winter from typhus. And in his pocket, he carries a crumpled photograph of his brother, killed on the German front 9 months ago for a war he never understood. In 6 hours, Ivan will help destroy a 300-year-old empire. In 10 years, his own government will execute him for counter-revolutionary activities. He will die in a frozen prison camp in Siberia, forgotten by the very revolution he helped create. This is the story of the most successful betrayal in human history, and the question nobody asks: why did they actually do it? Because what you think you know about the Russian Revolution, you've been lied to. And the proof is buried in a letter that wasn't discovered until 2003, written by a man who orchestrated the entire collapse, admitting that everything, every promise, every speech, every guarantee of freedom was a calculated deception from the very beginning. By the end of this story, you'll know the answer to 3 questions that historians still fight about to this very day. Why did the world's largest empire collapse in less than a week? Who really wanted the Soviet Union, and who tried desperately to stop it? And what did the revolutionary leaders promise their own allies that they never, ever planned to keep? Here's the part that will shock you. The Soviet Union wasn't supposed to exist. Even the man who created it didn't want it. Not like this. Not with the rivers of blood that would follow. Not with the millions who would die in camps and famines and purges. So what went wrong? How did a movement that promised bread, peace, and freedom become one of the most oppressive regimes in human history? The answer starts not in 1917, but 30 years earlier, with an execution that changed one man's life forever. A young man named Alexander Ulyanov is hanged in the courtyard of a Russian prison. His crime? Attempting to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. He was 21 years old, a university student. Brilliant, idealistic. He believed that killing the Tsar would somehow free the Russian people. It didn't. It just got him killed. But Alexander had a younger brother, a 17-year-old boy who worshipped him, who studied everything Alexander studied, who read every book Alexander recommended. That boy's name was Vladimir Ulyanov. You know him better by the name he would later adopt, Lenin. The day his brother was executed, Vladimir made a promise. He would finish what Alexander started, but he would be smarter, more patient, more ruthless. He wouldn't fail. And 30 years later, standing in that same city where his brother died, Lenin would watch an empire collapse exactly as he had planned. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand why the Soviet Union was created, you first have to understand the world it replaced. And that world, in 1913, seemed absolutely untouchable. 1. Imperial Russia. The Russian Empire controlled 1/6 of the Earth's entire land surface. From the frozen Arctic in the north to the deserts of Central Asia in the south. From Poland in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east. 160 million people lived under the rule of a single family. The Romanovs. They had ruled for 304 years. Tsar Nicholas II, the current emperor, controlled the largest standing army on the planet. Over 1 million soldiers. He was the richest monarch in Europe. His family's wealth was estimated at over $45 billion in today's money. The Winter Palace where he lived had over 1,000 rooms. His private train was covered in gold leaf. He owned more land than any human being in history. And he believed, genuinely believed, that God had personally chosen him to rule, that he was anointed, that to question him was to question God himself. Nicholas wasn't a cruel man by nature. He loved his wife, Alexandra, deeply. He adored his 5 children. He spent hours playing with them, reading to them, teaching his son Alexei how to shoot. He wrote in his diary almost every day mundane observations about the weather, about what he ate for dinner, about his children's health. He seemed, in many ways, like a devoted family man who happened to be an emperor. And that's what makes what happens next so absolutely tragic. Because Nicholas genuinely could not understand why his people were suffering. He lived in a palace with 1,000 rooms while millions of his subjects lived in one-room shacks with dirt floors. He ate 5-course meals while peasants boiled tree bark to survive the winter. But in his mind, this was the natural order of things. This was how God intended the world to work. The Tsar ruled, the people obeyed, and everyone would be fine if they just accepted their place. But by 1913, cracks were already forming in the foundation of the empire. Cracks that Nicholas either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. Russia was rapidly industrializing. Factories were being built in every major city. Millions of peasants were leaving their villages and moving to urban centers like Moscow and Petrograd, looking for work. These new factory workers lived in conditions that would shock you. Entire families crammed into single rooms, working 16-hour shifts. Children as young as 8 years old operating dangerous machinery. No safety regulations. No health care. No time off. If you were injured, you were fired. If you complained, you were beaten. If you tried to organize, you disappeared. The average life expectancy for a factory worker in Russia in 1913 was 32 years old. 32. And while these workers were dying in factories, the Tsar was building another palace. The wealth inequality was staggering. The top 1% of Russians controlled over 90% of the nation's wealth. Peasants, who made up over 80% of the population, owned almost nothing. Most didn't even own the land they farmed. They were essentially serfs, tied to land owned by aristocrats, forced to give most of their harvest to landlords who never worked a day in their lives. And if you think that sounds medieval, you're right. Because serfdom had only been officially abolished in Russia in 1861, just 52 years before 1913. That's less than a human lifetime. There were people still alive in 1913 who had been born as serfs, as property. And while they were technically free now, the system hadn't really changed. The land still belonged to the rich. The peasants still starved. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline sat in a cramped apartment in Switzerland, writing furiously in a notebook. This was Vladimir Ulyanov, Lenin. He was 43 years old, balding, short, unremarkable in appearance. He'd been living in exile for 17 years, bouncing between Switzerland, France, and England, always one step ahead of the Tsarist secret police who wanted him arrested or dead. Lenin had devoted his entire adult life to studying revolution. He read everything: history, economics, philosophy, military strategy. He spoke 5 languages fluently. He'd written over 30 books and hundreds of articles, most of which almost nobody had read. His own mother, who loved him dearly, thought he'd wasted his life chasing impossible dreams. She begged him to come home, to settle down, to get a normal job. He refused, because Lenin believed, with absolute certainty, that capitalism would eventually collapse under its own weight, that workers would rise up against their oppressors. That revolution was inevitable. But here's the thing: Lenin didn't actually believe it would happen in his lifetime. In January 1917, he gave a speech to young socialists in Switzerland. He told them, and this is a direct quote, "We of the older generation may not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution." He thought he would die in exile. He thought he'd never see Russia again. He was wrong. For months later, the Tsar was gone, and Lenin would return to lead the most radical political experiment in human history. But what changed? What happened in those 4 months that turned an impossible dream into reality? The answer starts with the worst decision Nicholas II ever made. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. August 1914, Europe explodes into war. What starts as a regional conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia rapidly spirals into a continental nightmare. Germany, France, Britain, Russia, everyone picks sides and mobilizes their armies. Russia, bound by treaty to Serbia, declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. Nicholas II believes this will be a quick war, a glorious war, a chance to unite the Russian people against a common enemy and prove Russia's strength to the world. He appears on the balcony of the Winter Palace before a massive crowd and declares that Russia will fight until victory. The crowd cheers. They wave flags. They sing the national anthem. Young men rush to enlist, believing they'll be home by Christmas. They weren't. World War I became the most catastrophic conflict in human history up to that point. And Russia, despite having the largest army, was completely unprepared for modern warfare. Russian soldiers were sent to the front with outdated rifles, sometimes without rifles at all. They were told to pick up weapons from dead comrades. They wore thin uniforms in the freezing cold. They marched in boots that fell apart after a few weeks. Their commanders, mostly aristocrats who had bought their positions, had no idea how to fight a modern war. They sent wave after wave of men charging directly into German machine gun fire. It was slaughter. In the first year of the war, Russia suffered over 2 million casualties. 2 million. Dead, wounded, or captured. And the war didn't end. It dragged on. Year after year. More men conscripted. More families destroyed. More villages left with only women and children and old men. By 1917, Russia had lost over 7 million soldiers. 7 million. The economy was collapsing. Factories that should have been producing consumer goods were making weapons. Farms that should have been growing food were abandoned because all the men were at war. Inflation skyrocketed. The price of bread increased by 500% in 3 years. People were starving. Not just poor people. Everyone. Middle-class families were selling their furniture to buy food. Children were dying from malnutrition in the streets of major cities. And Nicholas, isolated in his palace, kept insisting that Russia had to keep fighting. That retreat was dishonor. That God would grant them victory. But the people had stopped listening to the Tsar. They'd stopped believing in him. And in February 1917, everything fell apart. It started on International Women's Day, February 23, 1917. Thousands of women, mostly textile workers, walked out of factories in Petrograd. They weren't planning a revolution. They were just hungry, exhausted, angry. They marched through the streets carrying signs that read, "We want bread," and "Down with the war." By evening, 90,000 people had joined them. By the next morning, 200,000. The protests grew. Factory workers, students, even soldiers began joining. The Tsar, who was away at military headquarters, received telegrams about the unrest. He dismissed them. He called the protests nonsense and ordered the police to restore order. But the police couldn't control crowds this large. So Nicholas ordered the military to intervene. March 10, 1917. Soldiers are ordered to fire on protesters in the streets of Petrograd. Some units obey. Shots ring out. People fall. Blood stains the snow. But then something extraordinary happens. One regiment, the Pavlovsky Regiment, refuses to fire. The soldiers lower their rifles. Some of them turn and shoot their own officers instead. Within hours, the mutiny spreads. Regiment after regiment refuses to obey orders. Some actively join the protesters. By March 12th, over 60,000 soldiers in Petrograd have switched sides. The Tsar has lost control of his own capital. Nicholas is on a train, trying to return to Petrograd to take command. But railway workers, sympathetic to the revolution, block the tracks. His train is diverted, rerouted. He ends up stranded in a small town called Pskov, surrounded by military generals who tell him the truth he doesn't want to hear. "Your Majesty, you must abdicate. The people won't follow you anymore. The military won't fight for you. If you don't step down, Russia will descend into total civil war." Nicholas sits alone in his private train car that night. He writes in his diary, "All around me, treachery, cowardice, and deceit." On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II signs the abdication document. 304 years of Romanov rule ends with a signature. The Tsar, who believed he was chosen by God, gives up the throne without firing a shot. He asks only to be allowed to live quietly with his family. That request will be denied, but we'll get to that later. March 1917. The Tsar is gone. Russia is now, technically, a democracy. A provisional government is formed, led by moderate politicians and reformers who promise free elections, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. The man who emerges as the leader is Alexander Kerensky. He's young, only 36 years old, a brilliant lawyer and passionate speaker. He gives fiery speeches about liberty and justice and the new democratic Russia. The people love him at first. He promises to end the war, but only after negotiating an honorable peace. He promises to redistribute land to the peasants, but only after proper legal procedures. He promises elections, but only after stability is restored. Do you see the problem? Every promise came with a condition. Every reform was delayed. And meanwhile, soldiers were still dying on the front. 3,000 Russian soldiers died every single day in the spring of 1917. Every day, families were still starving. Inflation was still spiraling out of control. Kerensky gave speeches. Beautiful, moving speeches about the future of Russia. But speeches don't fill empty stomachs. And while Kerensky was talking, another man was praying. April 16, 1917. A sealed train crosses the border from Germany into Russia. Inside that train is Vladimir Lenin. And here's where the story gets really strange. Germany, Russia's enemy in the war, paid for Lenin's trip. They provided the train, the security, and the money. Why would Germany help a Russian revolutionary return to Russia? Because German intelligence knew exactly what Lenin wanted. He wanted Russia out of the war immediately. No negotiations, no conditions, just total withdrawal. And Germany knew that if Lenin succeeded, it would free up millions of German soldiers from the Eastern Front to fight France and Britain in the West. So Germany essentially funded the Bolshevik Revolution to save themselves. They gave Lenin the equivalent of over $10 million in today's money. Lenin arrives at Finland Station in Petrograd to a massive crowd. Thousands of workers and soldiers have gathered to see this legendary revolutionary they've heard so much about. But most of them don't actually know what he looks like. He's been gone for 17 years. He steps off the train. Short, balding, wearing a wrinkled suit. He looks more like a tired accountant than a revolutionary leader. But then he speaks, and everything changes. Lenin climbs onto an armored car and delivers a speech that is only 10 minutes long, but changes the course of history. He doesn't talk about democracy. He doesn't talk about freedom or justice or legal procedures. He says 3 words, over and over. Peace, land, bread. That's it. Peace, land, bread. End the war immediately. Give land to the peasants immediately. Provide food to the workers immediately. No delays. No conditions. No waiting. Just action. For the first time in Russian history, a politician told the people exactly what they wanted to hear, and he meant it. Well, at least 2 out of 3. The crowd erupts. They cheer. They chant his name. And Lenin, standing on that armored car, knows he's just won. Because while Kerensky is promising democracy someday, Lenin is promising bread today. And in a starving country, bread beats democracy every single time. Over the next 6 months, Lenin and his Bolshevik party systematically undermine the provisional government. They don't use violence, not yet. They use propaganda. They publish newspapers. They give speeches in factories and military barracks. They repeat the same message everywhere. The provisional government is lying to you. They're keeping you in the war to please Britain and France. They're protecting the landlords. They're letting you starve. But we, the Bolsheviks, we will give you peace, land, and bread. Join us. And people do. By the thousands. By the tens of thousands. Factory workers form councils called Soviets and declare loyalty to the Bolsheviks. Soldiers desert the front and return home, refusing to fight anymore. Peasants, tired of waiting for legal land reform, simply seize land from aristocrats by force. The provisional government sends police to stop them, but the police are overwhelmed. Kerensky gives more speeches. He pleads for patience. He warns that chaos and anarchy will destroy Russia. But nobody is listening anymore. By October 1917, the provisional government controls almost nothing. They control some government buildings in Petrograd. That's it. The rest of the country has already moved on, and Lenin knows it's time to strike. October 24, 1917. Lenin sends a coded message to his most trusted allies. The crisis has matured. All power to the Soviets. We must act now. That night, Bolshevik forces begin occupying key positions throughout Petrograd. Telegraph offices, railway stations, power plants, bridges. They move quietly, methodically. Most of the city doesn't even notice. By 2 a.m. on October 25th, they're ready for the final move. The Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government, the symbol of Russian power for centuries. Inside, a few hundred soldiers guard the building. Outside, 20,000 Bolshevik workers and soldiers surround it. But here's the thing. This isn't a battle. It's barely even a fight. Most of the soldiers guarding the palace don't want to die for a government that can't even pay them. When Bolshevik forces approach, many of the guards simply walk away. Some join the attackers. A few resist, but half-heartedly. The revolutionaries enter the palace and arrest the government ministers without firing more than a handful of shots. Total casualties for the entire October Revolution? 5 people. 5. the so-called Great October Revolution. The event that Soviet propaganda would later portray as a glorious, bloody uprising of the masses was actually just a building occupation. But what happened next? That's where the real violence begins. The morning after the palace falls, Lenin stands before the Soviet Congress and declares that the provisional government has been overthrown. He announces that Russia will immediately begin peace negotiations with Germany. He announces that all land now belongs to the peasants who work it. He announces that workers will control the factories. The crowd goes wild. This is it. The revolution they dreamed of. Peace, land, bread, everything they were promised. But Lenin has one more announcement. He says that Russia will hold democratic elections for a constituent assembly that will determine the future government. Finally, the people think. True democracy. The elections are held in November 1917, and Lenin's Bolsheviks lose. Badly. They receive only 24% of the vote. The Socialist Revolutionaries, a rival party that represents the peasants, wins with 40%. By all democratic standards, Lenin should step down and allow the Socialist Revolutionaries to govern. That's how democracy works, right? The people voted. Lenin lost. But Lenin doesn't step down. January 1918. The Constituent Assembly meets for the first time in Petrograd. Delegates from across Russia gather to write a new constitution and establish democratic rule. Lenin allows the assembly to meet for exactly 13 hours. Then he sends in armed guards. They dissolve the assembly at gunpoint and order everyone to leave. Some delegates protest. They're arrested. Democracy in Russia lasts 13 hours. And that's when people realize they've been deceived. Lenin never wanted democracy. He wanted power. And now that he has it, he's not letting go. Almost immediately, opposition groups begin forming. Military officers loyal to the old regime. Moderate socialists who feel betrayed. Peasants who realize the Bolsheviks are seizing their grain to feed the cities. Minority ethnic groups who want independence. Everyone who isn't a Bolshevik suddenly becomes an enemy of the state. Lenin creates a secret police force called the Cheka. Their job is to eliminate counter-revolutionaries. No trials, no evidence, just arrests, executions, and terror. In the first year alone, the Cheka executes over 10,000 people. But that's just the beginning. Russia descends into civil war. The Reds, Lenin's Bolsheviks, against the Whites, everyone else. It's one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. Both sides commit atrocities. Mass executions, torture, entire villages burned, prisoners thrown into rivers to drown. But the Reds are more organized, more ruthless, and they control the cities, which means they control the weapons factories and the railways. The war drags on for 4 years. From 1918 to 1922, over 10 million people die, more than Russia lost in World War I. Millions more from famine, disease, and the chaos of a collapsing society. And in the middle of this nightmare, in July 1918, something happens that symbolizes just how far Russia has fallen. The Tsar Nicholas II is being held prisoner with his family in a house in the city of Ekaterinburg. He's no longer a threat to anyone. He's abdicated. He just wants to live quietly. But the Bolsheviks are paranoid. They fear that white forces might rescue him and use him as a symbol to rally opposition. So they make a decision. On the night of July 17, 1918, Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 servants are woken up and told they're being moved for their safety. They're led to a basement room. 11 people total. The youngest, Alexei, is only 13 years old. The family stands together, confused but not yet afraid. Then Bolshevik guards enter the room with revolvers. They read a brief statement. By order of the Ural Soviet, you are to be executed. Nicholas barely has time to say what before they open fire. The room fills with gunfire and screams. The children try to hide behind their parents. It doesn't help. When the shooting stops, some of the children are still alive, moaning in pain. The guards use bayonets to finish them off. Then they load the bodies onto a truck, drive them to a forest, pour acid on them to prevent identification, and dump them in a shallow grave. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty ends in a basement, with children bayoneted to death because they were born into the wrong family. And the Bolsheviks don't even announce it. They just say the Tsar was executed and the family was moved to a safe location. The truth doesn't come out for decades. By 1922, the Bolsheviks have won the Civil War. All major opposition has been crushed. Russia is devastated. The economy has collapsed. Industrial production is at 7% of pre-war levels. 7%. Millions are starving. The country is in ruins. But Lenin has total control. And on December 30th, 1922, he makes it official. He creates the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, the Soviet Union, a federation of socialist states. He calls it a workers' paradise. But it's not. It's a one-party dictatorship where speaking against the government gets you killed. And Lenin knows it. In his final years, as he's slowly dying from a series of strokes, Lenin writes a secret testament. He warns the party about Joseph Stalin, his successor. He says Stalin is too cruel, too power-hungry, too dangerous. He begs the party to remove Stalin from power. But after Lenin dies in 1924, Stalin suppresses the testament. And then Stalin does exactly what Lenin feared. He launches purges that make Lenin's terror look mild. He creates a famine in Ukraine that kills 4 million people. He sends millions to labor camps in Siberia where they freeze and starve. He executes his own generals, his own allies, anyone he even suspects might challenge him. By the time Stalin dies in 1953, he's killed more people than the Tsar ever did. Far more. But that's another story. So why? Why did they create the Soviet Union? Here's the real answer. The Soviet Union was created because the Tsar refused to share power, even when his empire was collapsing around him. It was created because the provisional government promised change but delivered nothing but delays and speeches. It was created because Lenin understood something that nobody else did. People don't want ideology. They don't want political theory or philosophical debates. They want food. They want peace. They want to feel like someone is listening to them. And whoever gives them that, whether it's true or not, wins. Lenin promised peace, land, and bread. He delivered peace by surrendering to Germany in a humiliating treaty. He delivered land by letting peasants seize it, which caused agricultural chaos. And he never really delivered bread. Millions starved under his rule. But by the time people realized they'd been lied to, it was too late. Lenin had the guns. He had the secret police. He had total control. And he used that control to build a system that would last 70 years and shape the entire 20th century. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The communist experiment failed, exactly as its critics predicted. But the lesson, the real lesson, is still here. When people are desperate, when they're hungry and scared and feel abandoned by their leaders, they'll follow anyone who promises them hope, even if that hope is a lie, even if it leads to tyranny. Because in the end, empires don't fall because of revolutionaries. They fall because the people in power stop caring about the people they're supposed to serve. And Russia in 1917 is the perfect example. The Tsar could have reformed. He could have shared power, ended the war, fed his people. He didn't. Kerensky could have acted decisively, ended the war immediately, redistributed land without delay. He didn't. And so Lenin, who was willing to do whatever it took, stepped into the vacuum and built an empire on the ruins of the old one. An empire built on promises he never intended to keep. So here's my question for you. If you were a Russian peasant in 1917, starving, exhausted, watching your children die in a war you didn't start, would you have joined the revolution? Or would you have fought to save the Tsar? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear the story of what Stalin did next, the purges, the gulags, the terror, the millions who died in camps and famines, subscribe, because that story is somehow even darker than this one. Thanks for watching.